Today on the NB Update, we look at some of the challenges facing local journalism. Dozens of people gathered in Sackville, New Brunswick recently to discuss the future of local news in the Maritimes. The event took place as local news outlets across the country continue to face financial difficulties threatening their survival. Data from the past 15 years shows that communities are losing their local news outlets, especially poorer communities. And in places where those local outlets continue to operate, cutbacks are causing newsrooms to shrink.
When we look closer at the data, is that at least 239 communities have experienced net losses, so more have closed than opened. And only 76 places across the country have experienced a net gain, meaning more local news outlets have opened than closed. The blight is spreading, I guess is what I'm saying. And this is in addition to, CTV canceling a bunch of its local newscasts, Chorus cutting the length of its global newscasts, so the scaling back as well of those newsrooms. Poorer, smaller places are the ones that have been losing local news organizations to date. So in terms of government policy, I think one of the clear messages here is that there needs to be some thinking, more serious thinking about where support for local journalism goes.
Researchers say that the massive changes that have accompanied the rise of the internet over the past few decades have made it harder for news outlets to stay in business, while social media leaves people exposed to rumors, misinformation, and propaganda. That's a problem, especially now that Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram, has blocked people from sharing links to news websites on those platforms in Canada. The social media giant made that move in response to the Online News Act, a law passed by the federal government in 2023 requiring companies like Meta and Google to share some of their massive profits with the struggling news industry. Against this difficult backdrop, people at the local News Matters symposium in Sackville shared ideas about how to keep local journalism alive. The NB Media Co-op live streamed the keynote speech and panels from the event. We also interviewed people, including one of the organizers and several of the attendees. We'll go to clips from those interviews now.
So why did you decide to organize this event?
Yeah, I think back in November, I had gone to a journalism conference organized by the Canadian Association of Journalists, and it had been so long since I'd been in the room with other journalists, and it got me really energized. And in particular, I was thinking, and especially after having lived and worked in Sackville for the past 5 years, being a local reporter, and sort of realizing that, we're a dying breed in a way. There's not a lot of people who do that sort of the basic everyday job of reporting on their local communities, what's happening with local councils, in business communities, and anyway, so I was thinking a lot about that, and just the lack of the number of local reporters that are working at that basic level.
And here in Sackville in particular, just saw the demise of the Saltwire newspaper in the past period of time.
In 2020, they pulled the plug right at the beginning of the pandemic, and that was the sort of final plug. It had been a Saltwire paper for a while, and when I went to university here in the 90s, there was probably 4 or 5 reporters and editors working at that paper. But in the end days, there was like 1 reporter and maybe 1 editor doing very part-time work there. So it had gone downhill. Like, you had already seen the erosion of the number of reporters working in the community by the time the actual paper died. That was just the final death knell. So this has been something that's been happening for a long time, and I think that we talk about media at a national level, but we haven't been really talking enough about how we just are missing like so many reporters, like an army of them that used to work in local news and now are not there.
Especially for local journalism, a sense of community is very important, because accessibility, while it's definitely a big issue, you can still have it be very accessible and nobody pays attention to it because there's no interest. So creating a sense of community is very important, because then you care about the news and you care about learning about the people in your community. And I think that's something we kind of lost during COVID.
And we're all facing the same sort of issues, like how do we run how do we run on an economic basis? What's our philosophy? Who do we serve? How do we go about serving our community the best? We all have the same questions, no matter if you have 10 staff, 1 staff, you're running out of your basement, or you have a newsroom of 30 plus people. We all have the same questions, and although that may seem kind of unnerving for the industry, I think it's a point of connection and a really good way to start to bring people together.
What's the role in society of journalism, in your view?
Definitely, it's the first draft of history, and it's asking the questions that need to be asked of city councils, even remote town councils, questioning the decisions of government. I think when you look at long-time reporters, especially like in New Brunswick, Jacques Poitras, the New Brunswick could look very different without characters like him asking questions of the government, and they've been in the legislature longer than most MLAs. That, I think, is the role.
It was so nice to be in a room with so many journalists and all covering local news. You work alone when you're in local news very often, although I do have a kind of colleague here, but just one. Here,
Erica Butler, one of the organizers.
Yeah, Erica Butler. And here you had a room full of local journalists, all sharing their problems, their ideas, and some very good ideas. And you realize how important local news is, and you realize the dedication of the people who cover it. Here they were saying, I do this not for the money or not because it makes me rich, but because this is what I love doing, and it's community support.
And were there any big takeaways in terms of those big ideas that people were talking about today for you?
Well, to me, it's the idea of collaboration. As I said, you're kind of alone and working in a kind of silo, and it's nice to be able to collaborate if that were possible, and benefit from that, yourself and whoever you collaborate with. And my dream would be that Canada's largest news organization, the CBC, have the mandate, the way the British Broadcasting Corporation does, to promote local journalism and local democracy by supporting it, sharing with it, training local journalists, and strengthening local coverage both on the CBC itself and for the local journalism areas, the smaller towns and cities, and so on. And that kind of thing, I think, would immeasurably improve local journalism in Canada.
You just heard clips from interviews at the Local News Matters Symposium in Sackville, New Brunswick, which took place on June 14th. We go now to more highlights from the day's programming, including from the keynote address by April Lindgren, professor in the School of Journalism at Toronto Metropolitan University. Panel discussions included people such as Vicky Hogarth of CHCO TV. I also spoke on that panel for the NB Media Co-op. You can find the full archive live stream on our online publication, that's nbmediacoop.org, or on our YouTube channel at NB Media Co-op. Thanks to our summer intern, Lucas Reynolds, for curating these clips after combing through hours of footage. Thanks also to Lucas and our manager, Jigmet Angmo, for their help with live streaming the event. For the NB Media Co-op, I'm David Gordon-Koch.
Just thought I would take a minute to review for maybe the non-journalists, if there are any in the room, why local journalism matters. And these are just kind of the quick notes on it. It builds a shared sense of community and understanding other people and issues and places and what's going on in the community. It provides people with the information they need to participate in local decision-making. And by that, I mean, covering municipal council, for instance, means that people will find out what was going on, that there's a discussion about, I don't know, building a 4-lane highway at the end of your street. before the decision gets made at local council, and it creates an opportunity for you to have a say in that. I think so often when we think about what does local journalism do, we think about it holds power accountable. But I think too often we don't think about these more subtle roles that it plays, but extremely important roles in terms of equipping people with the information they need to navigate and participate in the decision-making in their community. It holds, and of course there is the holding power accountable, countering mis and disinformation, which is increasingly becoming an issue, and polarization related to that, and then of course providing essential services during emergencies. The local news map. So it tracks changes to local news outlets going back to 2008. So now we have about more than 15 years worth of data. And what we track is what's closed, what's open locally, and increases in service, increases and decreases in service. And we cover local and community and daily newspapers, public and private TV and radio stations, and of course online news as well. So all that data is on the map, and we produce a report every 2 months and publish it on the website, Local News Research Project website, so you can actually see the data. We provide the spreadsheet and then a summary so that you don't actually have to do any counting or filtering by yourself. When we look closer at the data, is that at least 239 communities have experienced net losses, so more have closed than opened, and only 76 places across the country have experienced a net gain, meaning more local news outlets have opened than closed. The blight is spreading, I guess is what I'm saying. And this is in addition to, CTV canceling a bunch of its local newscasts, Chorus cutting the length of its global newscasts, so the scaling back as well of those newsrooms. There's that local presence of having feet on the ground and bodies in communities is disappearing. And I think this has really big implications for trust, because one of the things we know about this very difficult issue of trying to build trust in media in an era when we're all seen as rogues and knaves, is that having a person on the ground, having a reporter present, really is one of the key ways of building confidence in your local news media. Poorer, smaller places are the ones that have been losing local news organizations to date. So in terms of government policy, I think one of the clear messages here is that there needs to be some thinking, more serious thinking about where support for local journalism goes. The smaller, poorer communities are definitely harder hit, have been harder hit by the changes, and I think are at greater risk of becoming news deserts where there is no local provider of local news, or suffering from local news poverty, which is what I think is a more relevant way of thinking about what's going on. I think, where are the true news deserts in Canada? The actual truth answer to that question is we don't know. I think there's a role for local government in addressing the discoverability problem, which is increasingly becoming an issue with Meta. How do you get people to pay attention or know what you're doing and what you're writing about? So there's the Meta ban, and now I'm increasingly thinking about the challenge that artificial intelligence is creating for discoverability of local news, because that's what people are going to find out what's going on when they have a question. So they're not those Google searches that refer them to your site aren't happening at all as frequently. Instead, there's the Perplexity or ChatGPT. They're providing a summary answer. Obviously, local governments can adopt freedom of information policies that err on the side of openness as opposed to not. They can support local media with the advertisements that they have to run, although I'm not a fan of doling it out equally to the poor performers or the weak performers. I think you have to think, municipal governments have to think about we want to advertise and get messages out to people, who's reaching the most people, and that's how the money should be for advertising should be allocated locally. So the crisis in local news means people are increasingly having to work harder to get access to timely, verified, independently produced news. First of all, they have to find it, and then they have to decide if it's reliable. So, in a sense, everybody's having to become one of those old gatekeeper editors that used to decide what goes into the daily newspaper or on the appointment TV news time at 6 o'clock, and that of course is difficult, because it's increasingly getting difficult to figure out what's true and what's not as AI pollutes pollutes the internet. I think public safety is increasingly at risk in emergencies where reliable, timely news is in short supply. So now, these days, you have to have at least, I think, 3 or 4 revenue sources to supply. The advertising heyday is, for the most part, gone, and subscriptions are also difficult to come by. Only 15% of Canadians, this is last year, I'll be interested, Reuters is about to release the latest data on this, but as of last year, only 15% of Canadians were willing to pay or paid for any form of digital news, and most of them were getting deeply discounted access, deeply discounted subscriptions. So there's 2, I think, fundamental needs that we have to embrace going forward. I don't think either of these is going to shock you. But the first is that quality news coverage matters. You know, nobody's going to come to you anymore for the crossword puzzle, for advertisements, for games. There's all sorts of better places to go. So what you have to sell, and by sell I mean get attention, is quality coverage that matters and makes a difference to the community. And this can cover the gamut from, you know, something fun, sports, whatever, but it has to be, people have to think about your news organization and think, yeah, that's as essential to what we do as having clean water in our community, safe drinking water, or reliable emergency services. Finally, the other essential ingredient is related, which is, are you engaged with your community in a way that matters? So there's providing the news, but also to be seen to be providing the news and doing a bunch of other stuff, like convening events in the community, being a place for conversations in the community. So by that I mean, you know, holding these space events and creating space for these conversations. Technological change has fragmented audiences, so you can't, you know, count on everybody showing up for your newscast at 6 o'clock. So that's another factor. I think AI is really messing and has the potential to really mess with what's going on. I mean, somebody can watch this live stream and make a recording and have me say anything, basically, tomorrow. So that's a real problem locally. So I think that's also a threat. And that's why I go back to the fundamentals, which is you have to produce content that really matters to your community and be engaged with that community in a way that is meaningful and visible and consistent. And be present. I think it's very old-fashioned, but I don't have any better solutions than that. I'm not sure we can go back in time, and I'm not sure, I mean, the problem right now is people don't realize that they're not getting news on Meta. Like, the huge research has shown there's a big chunk of people who don't even know that news has disappeared, and that's fueling the disinformation problem. But I'm not sure. I guess I don't really know what I think. I don't think it's I don't think we can go backwards. I would like to see more innovative thinking about how do you get your links out there and how do you get people to follow those links. And again, go back to the basics. Go back to the basics.
You know, what does a community need? My father, who started our papers in 1963, Scottish immigrant with zero journalism background, but he sort of turned out to be the Wayne Gretzky of community journalism. He used to say, you know, a good community paper covers its community warts and all. And what he means by that was, you know, you're tough when you need to be tough, but you support when you need to support, and you're always there. And he passed away in 1998. My sister and I, 30 seconds, 5 minutes left? Holy jeez. So, autonomy, accountability, trust, personality. Those are the keys to local decision making.
6 months I was the editor of the Riverview Recorder. And I learned more about journalism in 6 months than everything that's on that piece of paper could have told me. And the story that tells it best is I covered a town council meeting, as April says, and I'd written about the people who'd spoken, and I had done a very good job. And I went to get gas at the gas station, and this guy comes out, he goes, "Are you the new editor of the paper? Are you Bruce and Ella's daughter?" And I went, "Yes, I'm Bruce." And I went to high school in this town, right? And is, well, you got my name wrong. That's what local news needs from its reporters. It needs the fact that you know the guy who spoke at council. You know that you will never spell his name wrong again. And if you do, he'll catch you at the local gas station and remind you. So I think two things. I love the idea of citizen journalism, but they should not replace trained journalists. Journalists who make curated decisions, who look for sources, who check whether they got it right. We need to start educating people about what media literacy is, and it's going to become important. So we need trained journalists, even if they're old and retired. Get them to come into your newsroom. Most of us will do it for coffee, to help train new people to do the job. So there you go. Thank you.
What do our community needs from local reporting? We first have to ask the question, who consumes the information? Who are we addressing ourselves to? And then once we have that answer, we can go and produce news or create information that relates or interests that generation. The older generations would search out information. Today, no, let the information come to me.
When I came to Amherst, there was about 55 to 60 people working at 10 Lawrence Street in Amherst, also here in Sackville with the Tribune Post. When Transcontinental bought us, we very quickly went down to 20-ish, 25-ish, and the reductions continued over the years. Just a couple of things that I've seen over the years. Technology is one of the biggest changes between the business. We missed the boat in Amherst. I think we did. We sort of resisted it. The other thing is, the bread and butter of the small papers years ago was the small mom and pop businesses that advertised. They bought ads. You know what? Those businesses disappeared when the Walmarts and superstores come in, and the Walmarts and superstores didn't advertise in newspapers. And the other thing I noticed is changing readership. Back in the days, everyone read the newspaper. When I grew up in Kensington, Prince Edward, read the Journal Pioneer every day. We all read the paper. If you were to ask, and I have asked this question of kids who I coach in hockey and baseball, do you read newspaper? And 95% of them say no. They get the news from this thing. Facebook, some even watch the Daily Show and think it's real news. They don't get the difference between that and satire. And the other thing I found in the last couple of years in the business, and I'll close with this, is President Trump. Someone's got to mention the P word. In 2016 and beyond, anyone who questioned him, especially in the media business, was considered the enemy, an enemy of the state. And believe it or not, some of that language started showing up in Canada.
What they found, without question, was that local journalism is by far the most trusted journalism. What they found, and this is starting where we get into Scaryville, is 30% of Canadians, 30%, don't consume any journalism. They get it from TikTok, they get it from YouTube. So that's a question for mainstream journalism to try to figure out, how do we navigate this? The data got even scarier. I think it was 11% of Canadians, 3.4 million people or something like that, believed, this was before the last federal election, but they believed that violence may be necessary to change the trajectory of our country. So I think, the whole media story and narrative and discussion about importance and supports and all this thing has to be overlaid with sort of the reality of media consumption in this country, and we all are sort of to blame for that.
Why do people go on Facebook and expose their lives? Why do they do that, I wonder sometimes? And you know what? They want recognition. They want people to admit or see that they count, their lives count, and people react to it. And a lot of people do that. And so when you go on the air or you go into a newspaper and you write down someone's name and you write it wrong, you're not doing the job of recognizing that person.
One of the big issues we have in these small towns is getting the message out from a municipal point of view of what's going on. But also, people turn to things like Amherst Rants and Rambles on Facebook and Sprinkle Matters on Facebook. And people post, you would not believe some of the things that they put on there. And one of the issues I used to have when I was editor of the paper, people would call me with a news tip and I say, okay, I'll check that out. And they say, oh no, it's on Facebook, so it's got to be true. Yeah. And I said, well, you know, I still have to verify it before I go run with the newspaper, because if it's not true, someone's getting sued. And they say, well, I don't care if I get sued. I said, well, I do if I get sued. But it's just that vacuum that's created by not having a daily or a weekly community newspaper or a functioning newsroom in a radio station in your small town really creates a lot of problems for a lot of small towns.
There is a gravitas to having your name in print that isn't on social media at all. So we're going through a transition. I think what may be dying is corporate media, not independent media who print.
There is a social responsibility to insist that archives be kept. And I say that as a longtime supporter and a student of public broadcasting. There's been a controversy. Much of the archive was sold off to a corporate entity about 20 years ago. And that's not a good thing. Let's find our libraries, let's find our archives that will, if the CBC doesn't want to keep it, that some academic organization could keep it. Archives of Canada is keeping some things, but something you thought was important right now, in 50 years might not be important, but something you didn't think was important might be important in 50 years. I mean, any journalist who's done research knows that you don't always know what's important in the moment. And so I'm making the case that yes, print journalism has provided us with a great deal of archival material. We need to make sure it's kept. But our public broadcaster has a responsibility, and we need to hold them to it. So.
I mean, that's the elephant in the room that we haven't talked about today. CBC. I'm the biggest supporter of CBC you'll find in this room, or I'm sure there's many. They've paid me a lot of money over the years to talk aimlessly about whatever I think. But in a province like PEI where there is no competing television media, it really matters. The 6 o'clock news still moves the channel. And CBC competes on every level. You can't open a video without being hit by 2 ads or something like that. That's not really how you act like a public broadcaster. They're chasing algorithms like every other media in the country, which is shameful. 2/3 of their employees are in Montreal and Toronto, which is shameful, and I think speaks specifically to how out of touch the senior management is in Toronto. They don't get what's important. So when they come up with a local news solution like a speed channel, and they impose it on Charlottetown, and all that means is that Louise Martin gets to work more. There's now a hard out time at 15 minutes. It's insanity. It's just an extra layer, but CBC National gets to say, hey, look, we're local. No, they're not. No, they're not. I think they're as bad as Postmedia for top-down decision-making, but nobody wants to talk about it. In Britain, BBC provides service and support for local media. We should have that conversation in this country.
Okay, yes. Absolutely, and I'll keep this short, but it is time that CBC Radio News went ad-free, and that's online as well. I mean, we should not be competing. It's $400 million, I get it. But then we have a truly independent source. We need a restructuring of our public broadcaster. We do not need to get rid of it, but we need to say what's important, and getting into news deserts, coming into provinces that don't have huge resources and aren't represented on the national stage in the same way is a critical part of that. So, yeah, I noticed that we are seeing an increase in newsletters. Anybody else noticing their inbox just flooded with great writers who are putting out newsletters? And so that tells me there's a need for like-minded people to share information. The worry of that is that we'll go back to creating silos. People who only share an interest in, beagles, or hating the current president of the United States. Because either way, it's a silo. One may be more important than the other. And I think the critical part of community news in a community is that you're all different. What you share is your geography. And geography is not going away. Geography is geography. And I think that that is a critical reason that we need to find a way to communicate with each other. Because we do have people not communicating now. We've got our phones to talk to. We don't have to look up and talk to people on the bus or when we're out for a walk and listening to a very important podcast. I don't want to talk to you right now, I'm busy. And so I think community news plays that role.
Initially, to just get them information, we've had to deal with things like forest fires, emergencies, things that I think Meta should be ashamed that they have taken that away from newsrooms. So it's not really, to me, about putting a link up all the time. It's about information for our community. I'm not necessarily trying to get hits to a page. It's communicating, and we've used social media really well with our community for that reason. And that's also why I wanted to keep it going. So we were using my page to do that, but at the same time, the St. Croix Courier, which has been serving our region since 1865, it was dying in the news block. And so it was a decision on our part, one it took a while to think about, but I think in all of our hearts we knew we couldn't let it die, and they approached us last minute as a Hail Mary, this paper's gonna close, and maybe you guys have the heart to take it on. And I don't know if anyone really wants to go into the newspaper business in 2024, because it seemed like a crazy idea, but we really couldn't say no. I mean, I think that when you ask yourself, why do you do what you do? You love your community is probably the answer, because I can't imagine doing this job if we did it. Yeah, so we took on the paper, brought Natalie in. We've been using a Google workaround. I don't know if many of you have been using a link on Facebook. We take screenshots of the articles that we want to get out to the public and do this Google redirect link with them. And so that's how we've been driving traffic from Facebook. You can do it on Instagram too, to our website, because that's been a struggle as well. But it is working. And those little tricks that you learn from talking to each other at events like this really are helpful and can be a big game changer. What I just said sounds so simple, but I use it every single day. And every single day it draws hundreds, sometimes thousands of new visitors to our small town website. Our next step for us, though, is, I think because we're small, because they see us at the grocery store, they see us at every council meeting. We cover 4 different council meetings. One's on an island we can't get to regularly, but we've trained a group of volunteers over on Graminan to film the council meetings, and then we're able to get those on TV too. But they really do see us everywhere. We're very accountable, we're very approachable, and again, our door is always open when we're at work.
Okay, Gwe, Madabalotio, Nin Delawisi, Maureen Gugu, and Deleawi Sabeganegadi. Hi, how are you all? My name is Maureen Gugu, and I'm from Sabeganegadi First Nation, which is a Mi'kmaq community in central Nova Scotia. I've been a reporter since I was 18 years old, so I've been doing this for about 38 years. And what I do is I run a news website called Google Gwest News. Google Gwest in Mi'kmaq means owl, and it is the true spelling of actually my last name, which is Gugu. So if anybody was wondering, that's what it means. And I launched Google Gwest News in 2015 purely as a passion project of mine. At that time, especially when I worked in mainstream media, I really was frustrated on how Indigenous issues were covered in this region. I had a specific vision of how I wanted to cover news. I wanted to cover news that people in my own community would sit down at the kitchen table and talk about. And the vision that I had was, when I was young, there was a publication called the Micmac News, and it was published out of Sydney, Nova Scotia, and every month it would show up at our kitchen table, and my family and friends and everybody else would talk about what was in that paper. And that's the kind of coverage I wanted to do, and it was really frustrated working in mainstream media, trying to reflect that coverage. I was constantly told by non-Indigenous editors and publishers that Indigenous stories in this region were not interesting enough to their listenership, viewership, or readership. And it frustrated me. And when I launched the website, I actually thought that I would make a ton of money and we'd be rolling in it. That's not the case. We've really had to adjust our manage our expectations. Right now, success for me is being able to pay the rent, being able to pay the utilities, having enough money to pay for gas to get on the road to cover stories. And for me, that's what makes me happy. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. I find that, you know, the stories that I do cover for the Indigenous audience, they're really craving to have the issues that are important to them, you know, put into perspective. And they tell me that when they see my stories, and I get such a sense of gratification from that. So basically, that is what I do, and that is how I do it.
We are, to my knowledge, the only New Brunswick outlet that has covered the outcome of the recent convention of the New Brunswick Federation of Labor, notably their resolution by union delegates to declare arms shipments to Israel as hot cargo that affiliate unions will not handle. So I think there's an audience for whom this kind of news really matters, and they find it with the NB Media Co-op. Briefly, a lot of my work involves, as well as reporting, working behind the scenes with community volunteers. So I train people. I also teach a course, as mentioned, through St. Thomas University at Elsipogtog First Nation. There's a couple journalism courses in that program, which allows people to complete part of their BA living at the reserve. And so Oscar Baker III also teaches a course there. You know, so their coursework involves interviewing people, and we've published a number of articles and videos by some of the students and former students in that program. Actually, we just put one in our live stream. We put one of those by Annalia Simon of Elsipogtog, who interviewed some elders about their new Wolastoqey dictionary. I got 30 seconds. All right, so just really briefly, you know, we work with people from anti-poverty groups, disability rights groups, and stuff like that. And I think an important part of this is self-representation. And you know, I guess I'll just finish by saying, I would suggest that it's not only possible, but necessary for there to be journalism of this kind that's, you know, verifiable, fact-based, you know, reality-based information that, you know, I think is marked, and again, you can decide for yourself, by fairness and accuracy, and rooted in social justice movements. And if we don't do it, who will?
And after 3 years of collecting only Google ad revenue, I said, I've got to charge for it, or I've got to stop doing it. And the people that read it, once I announced that there was going to be a paywall, warned me that people in Miramichi were cheaper than they were nosy. And I can say now, after 15 years, that they're wrong. They are willing to pay for it.
We are the eyes and ears of the community. The staff, me, I do 9 jobs. I'm the graphic designer, I do all the layout, I sell all the ads, I make all the ads, I do accounts payable, accounts receivable, HR, payroll, I answer the phone, I'm managing editor, I deliver my own newspapers, and I write some. And I don't sleep very much, obviously. I have no brick and mortar, everything is done in my 10 by 10 office in my basement. I was a journalist, but I also spent 13 years on my town council. And I know what a community newspaper does for a community at a very base level. And we are so close to losing a lot of this. We are the feeders of the big news, right? CBC pays attention to what we're doing. And without us, nobody in the province knows what we're doing, whether it's the media co-op doing it, whether it's Vicky doing it down on the shore, whether it's my friend Eric, who is now doing, right now, community news, but it's, you know, it's smaller. But we need to get help, and it's not just the help. I've got a minute. It's not just the help from getting money. We need the money to come in a timely fashion. For anybody who has LJI, you know. I've had to take my pension early. I am technically subsidizing my community because it's important. So someday I'll be rewarded for that, probably not in this life. But if they could do LJI for a 3-year portion, it would enable me to be able to get somebody to come to my community. They can't come if they can't guarantee you more than 1 year.
When I was a lot younger, I was very apprehensive of asking a lot of very controversial questions to Indigenous leaders, Mi'kmaq leaders, because in the Mi'kmaq community, we were taught that asking such tough questions is being rude to an elder. So you don't want to be rude to an elder. So it's something that you have to kind of overcome. Well, obviously I've overcome it. You know, as long as you're fair to the other side, it shouldn't matter. And at the end of the day, they get over it. I've found myself networking with a group of other Indigenous journalists and news media outlets across the country since last year, trying to figure out what can we do to support one another. And what we wound up doing in December, we decided to form the Indigenous Media Association of Canada. So we've been incorporated since January, and we meet weekly every Wednesday night where we're talking about what can we do to support other Indigenous journalists in the country. That's what I've been finding. What works for me is connecting with these group of 4 or 5 women every Wednesday night through Google Meet. That's what we do. And it's for me, it's refreshing to hear that, Indigen News on the West Coast is having the same issues as Google Quest News on the East Coast, or Eagle Feather News in Saskatchewan. So I've been, it's great to know that you're not alone and that we're trying to problem solve a lot of issues of sustainability. So just wanted to mention that.
And in the end, it came down to the framework, which is, well, what are we doing? What value are we creating? Who are you doing this for? So it didn't really matter the tools. It came back to these key questions of knowing what you're doing, and being clear about that. And I've heard a few people talk about knowing your audience, about being niche, right? Because you can't be everything to everyone. We have seen those news outlets, those media outlets disappear. And there is a key news literacy aspect to this, right? To be able to convey your value, you also have to tell people about what you're doing and how you're doing it. This is one thing that I've always liked that Tim's done, is when he goes on social and he'll tell people why a investigation or a story is taking as long as it does, the time that he spends at the courthouse to pull documents, the money that he has to spend on lawyers. This educational component is so, so important. And I wish that I could get every Atlantic Canadian, put them into a journalism course, into a news workshop, and say, you try to do a news story. And you will understand the effort, the work, the labor, everything that's involved here. And then maybe I can convince you now to pay for this. Because again, that's the other missing component.
I don't know that I want to call it tools, but I think the most essential elements of the Halifax Examiner are people. And there's come in 2 categories. And the first is staff. I cannot just stress how important those reporters out there doing the work are in so many different ways, and of late, how they're collaborating with each other, especially. As I think about how old I am, they're filling in all the holes that I can't do anymore. And someone mentioned succession. My plan is just simply to give the Halifax Examiner to the employees when it's time for me to step off the stage so they can continue doing it. It's been important to me to pay them until this year, I was the lowest paid employee at the Halifax Examiner. I'm telling you my experience because I think it's the takeaway that I'd like you to take, the broadest takeaway is that you have to do what works for you. And that may not be what works for me, but just to hear me say it may be of some use. And the provocation here is I want to flip everything you've heard on its head. I've been to a lot of these conferences like this, and I've learned all about advertising and funnels and newsletters and this and that, and I do not give a shit. I just don't. The Halifax Examiner has always been about during the news. But that relationship is paramount between the Halifax Examiner and our readership. I don't want them thinking that we think of them as a data point, as something to be traded, something to be fooled into giving us their money. I have the utmost respect for their intelligence and for their independence, and firmly believe that if we do good work, they will find us. I don't need to be fucking around with TikTok. I don't need to be chasing people on the Facebook, a platform that's destroying the earth anyway. You know, they'll find us if we do the good work. And that is what the Halifax Examiner has been about from day one.
And so in terms of the transparency, it is completely up to every publisher in this room, every journalist in this room to be factual and accurate, but there's no one watching you.
Can I ask a question? Is there an ethical or environmental concern with using AI?
Yeah, actually, we just wrote a whole journal article about this, where it was about the extent to which the ethical considerations are taken into account by newsrooms that are using some form of artificial intelligence. And the answer to it is, it's actually all over the map in the newsrooms right now, and there's no really consistent approach, and boy, that's a problem, because it's a huge factor in trust that the public has in these news organizations, and people just don't trust the machine to do it alone, and they shouldn't, because it gets it wrong all the time. There has to be a place for human intervention, and it's really important to have a conversation and be clear with your readers about how AI is being used. I mean, I think right now we're still really there's kind of people are really hating AI and everything that it represents, and others are thinking, okay, maybe there are some actual applications for it. So for instance, I just was reading the other day about in some regimes where it's really dangerous to be a reporter, that they're actually using AI to create avatars to actually be the news delivers as a way to protect the reporters from persecution in those regimes.
On the Coast Salt Weekly in Halifax and its new owners, which is Overstory Media Group, and the founders of the Coast, I don't know, some of you may not know this, but Kyle and Ori have left the Coast, and since then they've published some AI-generated articles, and the quality of the publication across the country, not just the Coast, is low, to put it that way. And one of my many concerns about AI, I mean, I have these global concerns about labor issues and the huge power and water costs of AI and all this, but directly related to Canadian journalism, my concern is that we've created, through the federal subsidy and Google money, we've created what I think in biology they call a phylum, like this whole level of an ecosystem of kind of crappy media-ish organizations that are just kind of leeching off the Google and the tax rebates and Post Media has bragged about it in their statements to shareholders. And I don't know that was what was intended, but now they're able to use AI to kind of produce something that looks like news copy, sort of, and my worry is that the average person out there in the world is going to see all this slop, all this crap that's being published with government subsidies or because of government policy, and they're going to turn on it. And all the rest of us doing real work are going to suffer.